Imagine standing alone in your tiny apartment, holding a police badge you can't show anyone, about to betray the people who trust you most. In 1969, Los Angeles, Lucy Hoffman wasn't just undercover. She was trapped between loyalty to her badge and the kindness of the revolutionaries she was ordered to destroy. Every choice she made could save lives or ruin them. The early morning sun cut through the blinds of Eileen O'Connor's small apartment as she stared at herself in the mirror. 24 years old, with blonde hair and blue eyes, she hardly looked the part of someone about to enter the heart of a revolution. She tucked her police badge into the bottom of her sock drawer, buried beneath layers of clothing. Little did she know that this same badge and everything it represented would need to stay hidden soon. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection. "Just stick to the story." Los Angeles in 1969 was a city on fire. Not always with actual flames, though there had been plenty of those too, but with anger, hope, and radical change. The civil rights movement had evolved. Some groups no longer believed in simply marching and singing. Some, like the Black Panther Party, believed in taking a stand, armed if necessary. That morning, Eileen put on worn jeans and a plain t-shirt. Nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention. She had memorized her cover story so thoroughly that she sometimes caught herself believing it. Would the authorities really believe her practiced statements and take her in? A disillusioned college dropout who'd grown tired of her privileged white suburban life and wanted to join the revolution. The LAPD had chosen her carefully, a rookie officer with no undercover experience, but something they thought more valuable: the fact that she didn't look like a cop. She was young, female, white, and she had a face that made people want to trust her. "Remember, O'Connor," her commanding officer had told her during her final briefing, "these people are dangerous. They are not activists, but they are activists. Your job is to get inside, gain their trust, and report everything back to us. Names, plans, weapons caches, everything." Eileen had nodded firmly, feeling a surge of pride. In a department dominated by men, she had been selected for one of the most important assignments in LAPD history. The Black Panther headquarters on Central Avenue was buzzing with activity when Eileen first walked through its doors. Men in black berets and leather jackets moved with purpose. Women organized stacks of pamphlets and prepared food packages. Children darted between adults, helping or playing, depending on the moment. Eileen's heart hammered in her chest as she approached the front desk. "I'd like to volunteer," she said, her rehearsed words coming out steadier than she expected. The man behind the desk looked her up and down, suspicion plain on his face. "Why would you want to do that?" She gave the answer she'd practiced 100 times. "Because I'm tired of watching from the sidelines while people fight for justice. I want to help." He studied her for a long moment before sliding a form across the desk. "Fill this out. Someone will call you." For 2 weeks, no one called. Eileen reported this back to her handlers, who told her to be patient but persistent. On the 3rd week, she returned to the headquarters. This time, she was met by a woman named Darlene, who put her to work immediately, stuffing envelopes with flyers about tenant rights. Eileen worked silently, carefully, trying to listen to conversations around her without seeming obvious. "You're quiet," Darlene said after a while. "Just trying to do a good job," Eileen replied. Darlene smiled slightly. "Well, we need all kinds. The loud ones get the attention, but the quiet ones get the work done." Days turned to weeks. Eileen became a regular at the Panther office. She helped with the free breakfast program, preparing and serving meals to neighborhood children before they went to school. She drove elderly members to doctor appointments. She stuffed more envelopes than she could count. Each night, she wrote detailed reports for her handlers, describing people, conversations, and routines. She listed who seemed most militant, who carried weapons, who talked about revolution versus who talked about community programs. But something unexpected was happening. The more time Eileen spent with the Panthers, the more complicated her feelings became. These weren't the monsters her training had described. They were people who were passionate, dedicated, sometimes angry. Yes, but also caring, funny, and fiercely protective of their community. She watched as Marcus, a former college football player, turned Panther lieutenant, gently taught children to read after breakfast. She saw Darlene organize clothing drives for families who couldn't afford winter coats. She observed their free medical clinic, treating people who had nowhere else to go. "Why do you carry guns?" she asked Marcus one day, knowing her handlers wanted more information on their weapons. "Same reason America does," he answered, without looking up from the book he was reading with a 7-year-old girl. "To protect what we care about from those who want to destroy it." That night, Eileen sat at her kitchen table for hours, unsure what to write in her report. As months passed, Eileen gained more trust. She was invited to strategy meetings. She learned about their political education classes. Some members even began to consider her a friend. James, a charismatic leader in the chapter, often sought her opinion on pamphlets and community outreach ideas. "You have a way of seeing things others don't," he told her once. And here comes the twist. The guilt that had started as a small knot in her stomach grew heavier each day. Her reports became less detailed, not obviously so, but she found herself leaving out personal details, focusing instead on public events and information that seemed less harmful. Her handler, Detective Wilson, noticed. "You're getting too close," he warned during one of their secret meetings in a downtown parking garage. "Remember who you are and why you're there. These people would turn on you in a second if they knew the truth." "I know," Eileen said, but something in her voice must have betrayed her uncertainty. "Listen to me, O'Connor," Wilson said, his voice hardening. "We're planning something big. The department's tired of waiting. These Panthers are stockpiling weapons and planning God knows what. We're going to hit their headquarters, and we need to know exactly who's going to be there and when." Eileen felt cold all over. "A raid? Not just a raid. We're sending in everything we've got. SWAT, tactical, the works. There are children there sometimes," she said, before she could stop herself. Wilson's eyes narrowed. "Your job is to make sure that there aren't any there when it happens. Give us the right time." "That's an order, officer." The date was set. December 8th, 1969. Before dawn, Eileen had confirmed there would be a meeting of Corps members that night, likely lasting until late. She provided floor plans, entry points, and a list of who would probably be present. But as the day approached, she grew increasingly restless. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The faces of people who had welcomed her, trusted her, shared meals with her, they haunted her every moment. The night before the raid, she found herself alone with James at the headquarters. They were the last two there, finishing preparations for the next day's breakfast program. "You seem troubled," James said, as they stacked boxes of cereal. "Just tired," she lied. James watched her for a moment. "You know, when you first showed up, I was sure you were a cop." Eileen froze, her heart stopping. "What?" He laughed. "I know. Crazy, right? A white girl walks in, wanting to help the Black Panthers. What else would I think? But you proved me wrong." You showed up. You did the work. You listened more than you talked." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's rare." She couldn't look him in the eye. "I should go. It's getting late." As she turned to leave, James called after her. "We're having an important meeting tomorrow night. Strategy for the new year. You should be there." Eileen nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Outside in her car, she broke down crying. Hours later, she made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her emergency phone, the one that connected directly to Detective Wilson. "We need to talk," she said, when he answered. "Not about the raid, about me." What exactly happened next? Some say Eileen warned certain Panthers about the impending raid. Others claim she simply provided incorrect information about who would be in the building. What is known is that when LAPD launched their massive assault on the Panther headquarters before dawn on December 8th, they expected to find most of the chapter's leadership. Instead, they found only 13 members, most of them younger, newer recruits. The gun battle that erupted lasted nearly 5 hours. Over 350 officers surrounded the building. Thousands of rounds were fired. Miraculously, no one died. In the aftermath, as Panthers were arrested and their headquarters destroyed, Eileen O'Connor vanished. Her apartment was emptied overnight. Her name disappeared from LAPD records. She became a ghost. Some former officers later claimed she was transferred to another division under a new name. Others believe she left law enforcement entirely, haunted by what she had done or failed to do. The Panthers themselves rarely spoke of the blonde girl with the kind smile who had come and gone from their lives. Those who suspected her true identity kept their thoughts private, understanding that in a war with no clear battlefields, everyone carried their own secret wounds. Years later, an internal memo surfaced briefly during a legal case. It mentioned Officer E.O. and her invaluable contribution to neutralizing a domestic threat. Nothing more. Eileen O'Connor, if that was even her real name, never wrote a memoir, never gave an interview, never publicly acknowledged her role in one of the most controversial chapters of LAPD history. But somewhere, perhaps a woman with blue eyes that had seen too much carried on with her life, walking between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, wondering if she had been a hero, a villain, or merely a pawn in a game much larger than herself. Some stories don't end. They just fade, like footprints washing away in the rain, leaving only the faintest trace that someone once stood there, faced an impossible choice, and walked away, changed forever. Years after the raid, long after the Black Panther Party had been knocked down across America, a woman sat alone in a small house on the outskirts of Portland. Rain tapped steadily on the roof as she sorted through a box she kept hidden in her attic. Newspaper clippings yellowed with age, a few photographs with faces she never allowed herself to forget, and a single black beret. Eileen O'Connor, now living under a different name, with graying hair and lines around her eyes that came from years of looking over her shoulder, had never escaped the shadow of what she'd done. The official narrative painted her as a hero who had infiltrated dangerous radicals. But she knew a more complicated truth. The Panthers she had betrayed had been fighting their war, not against America, but against poverty, against inequality, against a system that had declared war on them first. In rare moments of honesty with herself, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, she acknowledged that their breakfast programs had fed more children than her police work ever saved, that their medical clinics had healed more bodies than her intelligence had protected. The LAPD had given her a commendation that she'd never displayed, and a new identity she wore like an ill-fitting coat. Twice, she had almost reached out to James, whose trust in her had been so complete it still made her chest ache. She'd tracked his life from afar, his years in prison after a later raid, his eventual release, his tireless community work, even after the Panthers were gone. Once, she had driven all the way to the community center where he worked, sat in her car for 3 hours, but couldn't summon the courage to go inside. What would she say? That she was sorry? That she had believed she was doing the right thing? Somewhere between her obligation to her badge and her growing understanding of what the Panthers were truly fighting for, she had made choices that haunted her every day. The rain grew heavier as she carefully returned the items to the box. Tomorrow, her daughter would visit, a daughter who knew nothing of her mother's past, who believed she had been a secretary in Los Angeles before moving north. Sometimes Eileen caught herself studying her daughter's face for signs of the moral clarity she herself had lacked at that age. Her daughter was an activist too, fighting for criminal justice reform, often speaking passionately about historical injustices, including the government's campaign against the Black Panthers. The irony was almost too much to bear. As she closed the box and returned it to its hiding place, Eileen wondered, as she often did, about parallel lives. What if she had truly joined the Panthers instead of infiltrating them? What if she had refused the assignment entirely? What if she had warned everyone, not just a selected few? The storm outside intensified, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the sky like the echo of a long-ago battle on a Los Angeles street where history had been written in betrayal and gunfire. She had chosen a side once, believing in black and white certainties. Now, decades later, she lived in the gray spaces between carrying the weight of a revolution she had helped to crush and the question she would never be able to answer when the powerful wage war against those fighting for change. Which side of history is the right one to be on? And that's a wrap on the forgotten story of Eileen O'Connor, the woman who walked between two worlds until she could no longer ignore the human cost of her deception. What would you have done in her shoes? Could you live with betraying those who trusted you? Or would you have warned them all? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Did this hidden chapter of LAPD history surprise you? Well, then we have another story for you. One that's also from a woman in the U.S. in the 1950s, but with a completely different life story.
Mid-20th century America radiated optimism, with shiny suburbs, new gadgets, and the glow of family TV screens selling the dream of domestic bliss. Yet beneath the polished surface, a restless energy brewed. Rock and roll's raw rebellion and the quiet struggles of those who didn't fit the mold hinted at a far more complex reality behind the picket fences. Within this environment of seeming conformity, a woman emerged who challenged the deeply ingrained expectations of her gender. Her name was Marie Baker. This name, however, would eventually be overshadowed by a more sensational and ominous label, the Blonde Bandit. This nickname, whispered with a mixture of fear and fascination, or emblazoned across newspaper headlines, became a symbol of defiance, a direct challenge to the societal constraints placed upon women in that era. The name sold newspapers, ignited intense discussions, and stood in stark contrast to the modest femininity expected of women at the time. Marie Baker was not a product of the criminal underworld. She was not raised in an environment of deceit or tutored in the arts of crime, nor was she the stereotypical criminal mastermind often depicted in fictional narratives. Neither was she simply a victim, a passive figure manipulated by others. Her story is a far more complex and unsettling study of human nature, a narrative woven with threads of desperation, a potent and sometimes weaponized charm, a clever capacity for manipulation, and a series of important choices. Some of these choices were likely made with a full understanding of the potential consequences, while others were perhaps dictated by circumstance, by the limited avenues available to women in a society still largely governed by male dominance. Born in 1929, the end of a decade of perceived prosperity, in a modest town in Kansas, Marie's early life was far removed from the glamorous image that would later become her public identity. Her formative years were marked by hardship and loss. The early death of her father cast a long shadow over her family, forcing them into a struggle for survival, a stark reality that contradicted the existing narrative of American affluence. Marie learned the difficult lessons of resilience at a young age, understanding the value of hard work and the gnawing anxiety of financial insecurity. She possessed a keen intellect, a sharp mind that her teachers recognized, hinting at a potential that her circumstances threatened to suppress. And, as many who encountered her would later acknowledge, she possessed a striking beauty, a vibrant presence in an otherwise ordinary setting. Her charm, even in its early stages, was a subtle but powerful force, a way to navigate a world that offered few protections for a young woman without a father's support. However, this very beauty, this undeniable allure, would prove to be a double-edged sword, opening some doors while simultaneously making her vulnerable to unwanted attention and the predatory gazes that lurked beneath the surface of societal expectations. As she reached her early 20s, the charm of the big city, the perceived promise of opportunity and anonymity drew Marie to Chicago, an urban center filled with both boundless ambition and a hidden, often dangerous, underbelly. She sought to escape the confines of her small-town past, hoping to reinvent herself in the middle of the urban sprawl. She found work as a waitress, a physically demanding and emotionally draining occupation where meager tips were barely sufficient to cover basic living expenses and the persistent worries about the future. The constant noise of the diner, the clatter of dishes, the relentless stream of orders formed the monotonous soundtrack of her days. Yet, like many young women of her time, she held onto idealized visions of a better life, glimpses seen in the glossy pages of magazines and the romanticized narratives of Hollywood films, a stark and often painful contrast to her own daily struggles. She yearned for finer things, for a life beyond the drudgery she knew. Then, into this world of weary routine, stepped Jack Fowler. He appeared almost as if from the pages of a crime novel, a persuasive drifter with an air of worldly sophistication and a captivating charisma. He possessed a certain dangerous charm, a glint in his eye that suggested a life lived outside conventional boundaries. For Marie, Jack represented an escape, a thrilling deviation from the predictable path of her existence. His promises were attractive, hinting at adventure, fast cars, and easy money, a world painted in bolder, more dangerous colors. He offered a glimpse beyond the mundane, a taste of rebellion that resonated with a part of her that felt stifled and unseen. She became involved with him quickly and intensely, perhaps blinded by the attraction of the forbidden, unaware of the ominous clouds gathering on the horizon, the violent storm that was about to engulf her life. The year was 1953. The two embarked on a journey that would finally alter their lives and etch their names into the annals of American crime. Their initial target was a seemingly unremarkable bank situated in the quiet landscape of Des Moines, Iowa. Witnesses later recounted the scene with a mixture of disbelief and fear, their memories painting a picture of unexpected calm punctuated by moments of stark terror. A strikingly beautiful blonde woman, radiating an almost unsettling composure, stood watch outside, her presence an unlikely and effective diversion. Inside, her male accomplice, his features often obscured by the brim of a hat, moved with practiced efficiency, his charm replaced by a steely resolve. A demand was made, a transaction completed under pressure. $10,000, a significant sum in that era, far more money than Marie had likely possessed in her lifetime. Adjusted for inflation, this amount would be well over $100,000 today, a life-altering sum that fueled their daring escape and set them on a dangerous course. Marie's role was far more significant than that of a mere accomplice or passive observer. As their criminal enterprise gained momentum, she evolved into the very public face of their operation, her beauty and poise becoming their most potent tools. Her striking appearance and outwardly calm demeanor served as a deliberate tactic, a means of disarming suspicion and lulling unsuspecting bank staff into a false sense of security. Witnesses consistently described her as polite, even friendly, often engaging bank tellers in seemingly innocuous conversation, her charm effectively masking the criminal intent beneath the surface. But what if everything you've heard about the blonde bandit is wrong? What if Marie Baker, the woman vilified by the press and romanticized in folklore, wasn't just a charming accomplice or a coerced victim? What if she was the real mastermind, using Jack Fowler as her puppet all along? Could it be that the so-called victim pulled the strings in this dangerous game? The evidence might just shatter everything you think you know. But to understand how this shocking possibility unfolds, we need to take a closer look at the pivotal events that would seal their fate and leave an indelible mark on American crime history. While she smiled and made polite inquiries, Jack would be executing the robbery, their partnership a chillingly effective combination of charm and intimidation. Together, they embarked on a brazen spree of bank robberies across the unsuspecting towns of the American Midwest, each heist more daring and audacious than the last, pushing the limits of their luck and testing the capabilities of local law enforcement, who often seemed ill-equipped to handle such a sophisticated and unconventional pair of criminals. For a brief but intense period, fueled by adrenaline and a growing sense of invincibility, they appeared untouchable, moving through the heartland, leaving behind a trail of bewildered victims and mounting frustration for the authorities. The media, ever attuned to a compelling narrative, seized upon their exploits, and the nickname the Blonde Bandit was born, instantly capturing the public's imagination and transforming Marie into a figure of both fear and fascination. Sensational headlines screamed her name, portraying her as a modern-day femme fatale, a master manipulator who used her beauty as her most effective weapon, seemingly outwitting the forces of law and order with ease. But beneath the sensationalism, a more complex and disturbing truth began to emerge, a narrative far more nuanced than the simplistic portrayals in the press. Marie's own accounts, shared years later under very different circumstances, offered a starkly contrasting perspective, depicting Jack as the true driving force, a manipulative and controlling figure who held her captive through fear and the constant threat of violence. However, even Marie's own narrative was not without its complexities and contradictions. She was far from a passive bystander swept along by Jack's criminal ambitions. She adapted quickly to their dangerous lifestyle, learning the intricacies of their operation, her initial fear perhaps giving way to a chilling sense of efficiency and, potentially, a distorted sense of agency. Evidence, carefully gathered by investigators, suggested a level of willing participation that complicated her claims of being merely a victim. The stolen money, the thrill of the escape, the undeniable power they wielded, these factors suggested a more active role than she later admitted. Perhaps she began as a victim of Jack's charisma and compulsion, but at some point, she found a dark kind of empowerment in their criminal partnership, a sense of control in a life that had previously offered her very little. But why did a single, seemingly insignificant mistake turn into their ultimate downfall? Well, their audacious crime spree lasted for 2 years, a testament to their cunning and the limitations of law enforcement resources at the time. They skillfully evaded capture, moving from town to town, staying one step ahead of the increasing pressure from local authorities and the increasingly focused investigation led by the FBI. But by 1955, their luck, as is often the case with ill-gotten gains, began to fail. In Indiana, a crucial tip reached the local police, a seemingly minor report about a suspicious couple who fit the now infamous description of the blonde bandit and her accomplice. What ensued was a dramatic high-speed pursuit, a scene reminiscent of the very crime thrillers that were beginning to romanticize their exploits. Witnesses later recounted the surreal spectacle of a blonde woman throwing bundles of cash from the window of their speeding getaway car, a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to slow their pursuers, a symbolic shedding of their stolen fortune in a desperate bid for freedom. The tactic, while dramatic, proved ineffective. The pursuing officers, relentless in their pursuit, closed the gap. Their run was over. They were apprehended, their names added to the growing list of captured criminals. The whirlwind of their audacious crime spree brought to an unexpected and decisive end. The ensuing trial transformed the quiet courtroom into a charged arena of moral debate and conflicting narratives. Marie's defense team carefully constructed a narrative of pressure and threat, portraying her as a vulnerable young woman who had fallen under the Svengali-like influence of the charismatic but ultimately ruthless Jack Fowler, arguing that her actions were not those of a willing participant, but rather the desperate acts of a woman trapped in a dangerous and abusive situation. The prosecution, equally committed to their pursuit of justice, countered with a compelling array of evidence highlighting Marie's active involvement in the robberies, emphasizing her charm and poise as tools used to facilitate their crimes, arguing that she was far more complicit and blameworthy than her defense was willing to concede. Public opinion remained sharply divided, a reflection of the complex and often contradictory perceptions of women, crime, and agency in mid-century America. Yet, an unexpected revelation during the trial added a new dimension to Marie's story. Hidden in the investigative files was evidence tying her to a string of unsolved thefts in Chicago before she ever crossed paths with Jack Fowler. The thefts, targeting affluent homes, involved carefully planning and a strikingly similar use of charm and deception. This revelation, though not widely publicized at the time, suggested that Marie may have had a criminal streak long before her fateful encounter with Jack. Was she already cultivating a double life, laying the groundwork for the infamous spree that would later captivate the nation? Or was this early dalliance in crime another desperate attempt to escape the confines of poverty, a precursor to her later, more notorious exploits? The revelation cast a shadow over the narrative of victimhood she presented during the trial, introducing yet another layer of intrigue to her already enigmatic story. To some, she was a tragic figure, a victim of circumstance and a manipulative man. To others, she was a cold and calculating criminal who had used her beauty to mask her deceit and exploit innocent people. The court ultimately delivered its verdict, a judgment that reflected the complexities of the case and the divided opinions surrounding it. Marie Baker was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Jack Fowler received a longer sentence of 20 years. Their deafening and headline-grabbing partnership, a volatile mix of charm, desperation, and criminality that had captivated and troubled the nation, was finally and irrevocably concluded. Marie served her time with a quiet and determined resolve, deliberately avoiding the media attention that had once surrounded her. Upon her release from prison, she made a conscious decision to disappear from public view, seeking anonymity far from the spotlight of her past notoriety. Records indicate that she relocated to California, adopting a new identity and living out her days in quiet insignificance, never again returning to the life of crime that had briefly defined her existence. Her legacy, however, persisted, a subject of ongoing reflection and debate. The story of the blonde bandit became a point of reference for broader discussions about gender roles, the complex power dynamics within relationships, and the often indistinct boundaries between victimhood and guilt, particularly for women navigating a society that often presented them with limited options and placed them in vulnerable positions. Marie's tale serves as a stark and enduring reminder of how easily the distinctions between victim and criminal can become blurred, especially for women attempting to forge their own paths in a world still largely governed by patriarchal structures and expectations. Therefore, the question remains, who was Marie Baker? A criminal mastermind, orchestrating elaborate heists with cunning and precision. A victim of circumstance, a vulnerable woman pressurized into a life of crime by a manipulative and abusive partner. Or perhaps something far more complex and unsettling, a complex individual navigating a perilous landscape, making difficult choices driven by desperation, a yearning for something more, and perhaps a flicker of a darker ambition. Her story remains a compelling and puzzling chapter in American criminal history, a cautionary tale woven with threads of fleeting notoriety, reckless defiance, and ultimately, the quiet and perhaps hard-won anonymity of a life lived outside the gaze of public judgment.